Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion. My name is Tabitha Sturrett, and I'm a geologist and co-president of the Canadian Division of RESPEC. We're an engineering and geology consultant company that work on all aspects of the mine life cycle, from exploration to reclamation. For this panel, we will be discussing how sustainable development practices can create greater wealth across the mining industry. Companies are pivoting to focus on ESG, that they're being measured against by not only the regulators, but also from stakeholders, such as financial institutions, to investment communities, as well as the residents whose livelihood are being directly impacted by our projects. Sustainability and ESG practices are changing our industry and are here to stay. And we will be discussing how exploration companies, mining operators, and boards are adopting more sustainable practices and how investors can assess their performance. So I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have Dr. Erin Babicki, and she is an associate producer of mineral processing in the Department of Chemical and Materials Engineering at the University of Alberta. She is currently commercializing microwave technology for the mining industry with Sapiro Mineral Systems, and is a founding director of Aurora Hydrogen, which is a startup developing technology for emission-free hydrogen production. Next, we have Ben Murphy. Ben is a mineral processor. He's our only male on today's panel. Thanks, Ben.
And the only follicle challenge member of the panel too.
Yeah.
That's diversity in action.
There we go. The first part of his career was spent working at mine sites around the world in technical and managerial roles. He then pivoted to the equipment supply side of mining and has worked for OEMs, both in his native Australia and in the Americas. He now works at FL Smith, looking at several large miners and shepherding their efforts in the gold space. He is also co-creator and instructor of the Micro Certificate in Economic Leadership developed by the Bradshaw Research Initiative for Minerals and Mining, called BRIM, at the University of BC. And finally, we have Carrie Howlett, who works with businesses providing support with corporate management, M&A support, financial due diligence, and risk analysis. She currently sits on several boards and has recently served as a chair of the Safety, Environment, and Corporate Responsibility Committee for SaskPower, leading the development and implementation of net zero carbon emission strategies for a large carbon-based power utility. Carrie works with boards and management teams to develop their ESG strategies with the purpose of creating long-term value for their companies and their stakeholders. So let's jump into the discussion here. So Carrie, with your experience with boards and executive teams, can you tell us what investors should be looking for when assessing corporate ESG strategies, and maybe touch on some of the challenges and opportunities you see that the mining industry are facing in the new landscape?
Thank you, Tabitha. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak. So when it comes to mining projects, investors are looking at opportunities and challenges, like you mentioned, in terms of ESG. So ESG obviously is something that is, that companies are looking at in addition to the basic profitability, but it doesn't usurp profitability. And so that's a very real challenge for miners, because these are commodities that we are selling. And so our objective is to get it out of the ground as cheaply as possible and as safely as possible and in the most effective way so that we can maximize our profit. However, there are some very real constraints being put on mining companies right now, a lot of expectations, and these aren't new, but now they have a new name and definitely a new focus from investors when it comes to ESG. And so some of the things that investors are looking for in terms of opportunities that mining companies can provide are things where you can develop technologies that can help you mine more efficiently, reduce your carbon footprint, be more sustainable in terms of the environment, perhaps get more and different products out of the ground, all while doing it with an investor focus on and a community focus and making sure that you have good diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. So, all of that, which is, again, something mining companies are not a stranger to, but certainly investors are putting more focus on it now, is really driving technological advancements in mining. And I know my fellow panelists have some really great experience with those. So I'll turn it over to them to fill in some better stories about that.
Can I just jump in on one thing there,
Yeah,
Karen?
absolutely.
I agree wholeheartedly with a lot of what you said, but I think one misnomer we need to clear up in our industry, and probably in some other spaces too, but let me address it in the mining industry, that things that are sustainable, that things that may have a net positive impact on the environment, they don't always cost more or lead to reduced profitability. I know in some of my previous roles, we've really focused on looking at optimizations, especially in processing plants. And we've often found it's something that actually improves performance, improves recovery, does also have a positive sustainability benefit. It might be reducing water consumption. It might be reducing power consumption. But quite often they go hand in hand. Sustainability does go hand in hand with profitability, I think.
I always love hearing that, because my background is finance and that's my jam. So I love it when, I think that always the trade-off is, are we sacrificing short-term profitability for long-term profitability? And, I think it's raising the bar really for how companies do business, especially in the mining industry, with regard to looking at these sustainable practices. We want to stay ahead of regulation. We want to stay ahead of every company wants to do things better, perhaps, than their competitors, and make the most money. And companies that are innovative are really raising the bar for the whole industry, which I think is good. I think it's really good.
Yeah, and definitely what you're saying is, yeah. And I think part of the challenge we have when we're in the ESG space is actually breaking down the silos between the production people, the sustainability people, the other stakeholders, the community people, just so everyone can understand what we're talking about and understand how we're phrasing things and framing things to actually see the difference.
I agree. Well, great discussion, guys. So why don't we talk a little bit about sort of the exploration phase of projects? I think that's what I do, is mostly exploration and resource definition. And, when you start out on a lot of these projects, how you set the stage is so important in how your ESG and how the communities are going to accept you in your projects. I know, Erin, you work a lot on the business or the technology side. So when it comes to junior companies, they seem to be really excelling in the ESG strategies. So, can you give us some maybe insight into why that is and what you're seeing in that space?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Tabitha. My experience working with junior and small to medium-sized companies, as well as equipment suppliers, has been such a pleasure. While some might think that investing in new technologies is expensive, in fact, there are ways to do this that are pretty low cost. For example, preliminary microwave testing. So, I have some drill core. I'm an exploration company. We're not mining yet, but I have some drill core. I can test whether there's, amenability to microwave treatment. Are there benefits for downstream processing? We can do that for a couple of $1,000s. So it doesn't have to be, multiple millions that's going into developing these types of technologies. It can be pretty low key to start. And working with universities is another very inexpensive way to explore new technologies. And so, shameless plug, but grad students are pretty cheap. They don't make much of a living wage. And these are really smart people that are working towards their degree. And if you can engage with universities to work on, developing new technologies, particularly around sustainability, because young people in particular are very passionate about improving sustainability of our industry. And they have some great ideas, right? They haven't been in industry for years and years. And, they're not stuck in, this is how we've always done it. They really can think outside of the box, particularly if they come from other disciplines. So, working with universities, inexpensive way, but also, a way to engage with new talent and to bring new people into the industry. So, we've had a lot of interest from junior companies, as well as larger companies in microwave technology. And they view it as a way to reduce energy in processing. Now, to Ben's point, like I can't sell or develop a new technology if there's no financial benefit. It's just not going to fly. If something is going to cost twice as much, but be greener still, really hard to sell that, right? So the technology we develop not only has to have a benefit for sustainability, it has to have a cost savings as well. And so we definitely aim for that. But another aspect that the juniors, or that I perceive the juniors, or that I hear from them that they're looking at, is they're looking at funding from different entities that require best practices, green practices, innovative practices, particularly companies that are working in like strategic metals for electrification. They're looking for funding from folks like Elon Musk. So they need to demonstrate that they're looking at these new technologies. And so that's been a real driver for some of these smaller companies to come to us and look at new technologies, as well as in the hydrogen space too. So, you know, really enjoy working with junior companies, small companies. You know, there's a lot of excitement in that space. They tend to, I mean, my perception is that, you know, by nature, they have a higher risk tolerance. So they're more willing to look at these new technologies, and they're in a place where they don't necessarily have an existing operation or a mill that they have to retrofit. So they can start to think from scratch, what would, you know, best practice look like for processing of this deposit. So it's another reason why juniors can be interested in developing new technology. And I think, you know, there's a lot of small and medium companies that are making a lot of strides in this space.
Well, and when we were going through our topics, that really intrigued me, because I thought it would be sort of the opposite, because, you know, the juniors or the exploration companies are really looking at finding the deposit and putting all their dollars into that. So that was a great thing for me to learn as well.
What was really cool about what Erin said is young people are excited to come do this.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
I think we should actually, and it goes for investors too. The mining industry is so consumptive by nature. We deplete our resource, our main asset. Like there's nothing else, no one else who does that. But there's also such massive gains. If you can get just a little change, it has such a massive impact. So as far as an exciting place to be on the sustainability front, mining's pretty cool.
Well, and I think too, universities are really, they've changed a lot over the last several years. You know, they want to listen to industry, they want to participate and provide value to the companies, rather than sort of doing things in their own little silos. So it's great to hear, Erin, that the universities are really truly doing that. So let's move on to maybe the metrics of sustainability and what investors can look for, and sort of what larger mining companies are doing. So, you know, Ben, as you just mentioned, the mining industry is really unique because we're mining a depleting asset, which is so different than anybody else, not a depreciating asset. So making, like you say, small little sustainable changes is key. Is there anything else that you want to add to that topic?
Yeah, thanks, Tabitha. It's a really interesting one, because there's a lot of people talking sustainability out there. And I suppose for investors, since that's our main topic, how do they judge? How do they come and look and decide that one mining company is better than another and invest in it, or even stack up mining against another industry? So there's a lot of things out there. My company, FL Schmidt, we have our, and we're an OEM that supports the mining and cement industries. We have our own targets, like many companies. Our project's called Mission Zero, and we're very focused at the moment on GHG emissions. The problem is we've got all the major miners have got their own sustainability initiatives, and they're sometimes hard to compare and contrast, especially for an investor who may not be a specialist in sustainability. So I think first, there are frameworks out there, and I think a lot more of the producers are getting onto these frameworks. Things like the Copper Mark, which is basically a program that's accredited. And the companies that join this have to meet certain goals, and they're audited on these goals for their various operations. So at least, you know, they're starting to adhere to a set of standards, and someone's checking on them to make sure this is real sustainability and people are improving and people are trying. It's not just some greenwashing exercise. There's other systems out there. One of the ones we like also at FL Schmidt is science-based targets. Once again, you can go look up their website. You can go look up companies that join this. the goals they set that are there publicly for everyone to see. And they're graded on this and they're watched on this. So I think that's a big help for a lot of our investors, especially if they're not specialists in the area. Measuring it's a whole different problem. It's a real challenge. Like, how do you measure? How do you compare mines? And that's the one that really bamboozles me. How do you compare a gold mine to a copper mine to an iron ore mine, or even compare a low-grade copper mine to a high-grade copper mine? And I think here you've got to come back to some of the financial, and I know Carrie definitely has some ideas on this with her background. When an analyst pulls apart a financial statement for a mining company or any other company, there's certain ratios they look for. Things like your current ratio, people look at the cash flows, what's coming in, what's going out, your assets to liabilities. I think we need to start moving that way, because in our investment world, analysts do like ratios. They're commonly used, and they're a great way of tracking things and also measuring efficiency. So rather than just having a big, we consumed X million cubic meters of water, maybe what we need to start encouraging and start looking at operation by operation is measuring a useful output. So it might be cubic meters of water per ton of copper, or pound of copper produced, or kilowatts per ounce. We already do this for mine operating costs. So is it really that big a chunk to do it for sustainability metrics?
And that's a great point, Ben, because you're absolutely right. You know, working with mine engineers over the years, we're already doing this work. We're already doing these calculations, and it's for efficiency, really, for making sure that we can get our costs down, our energy usage down, water usage down, that kind of thing. But ultimately, those are generally fairly proprietary. You know, you might be able to dig through a feasibility study at some point and find it. And unless the companies are highlighting their metrics and showing improvements over time. And you're right, having a ratio, you know, energy per dollar of revenue or pounds produced or so on, you know, that makes a big difference in terms of being, you know, comparable. And then you can compare within the industry. Is company A better than company B, and so on. Again, you know, the commodity is generally kind of common, but then, you know, how you get that out of the ground is where the companies can differ, and that's where that opportunity and the risk really is. And so you raise a great point about having that comparability, and I think that generally is the challenge that investors are having. And, you know, I think this is where the mining industry generally can you know, kind of build that bridge between where investors are, which is, look, we have ESG targets that our shareholders want us to meet. We have targets that we want to meet in terms of sustainability and other things like that. So, but we're just lacking the comparable data. And that's where the mining industry can help out these investors in that regard. I understand that it is always, you know, kind of a bit of an arms race in terms of, you know, who's the first one to share their number, and is their number really good? And this is where consulting companies can be helpful too, where you can come in and say, you know, maybe do some benchmarking studies for the companies that are already producing or in the process of developing their mine plans, and say, you know, how you compare to other companies is like this, based on kind of what we're seeing. You know, I think that's a good place to start. The whole ESG industry, especially from the financial side, is all about transparency. Generally, you get a higher ESG score if you are more transparent. Doesn't mean that your company has to necessarily be really good. You know, it's about, the industry is quite forgiving right now, recognizing that we are in that state of transition between idea and technical practice, that, you know, we're looking for improvement. So we want to see what your baseline is, and then we also want to see how you're doing over time. And acknowledging Aaron's point too, that, you know, this is the opportunity for junior companies. It's also sometimes a bit of a challenge because they don't have that baggage per se that some of these larger, more established companies might have. So sometimes they can get higher ESG scores than the smaller companies, just simply because they've got more transparency already built into their processes. And so, you know, the opportunity for the junior company is to come in and share what they're doing in terms of their plans. You know, I talk about how a smaller company is kind of like a speedboat, whereas a larger company might be like more like a freightliner, right? In order to make change for a freightliner and get to the destination, you got to start your turn a lot farther back. And so the quicker we can get ESG data out in front of investors and start to see where we can make those improvements, I think that's where the industry can really benefit from sharing those metrics.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's about improving. That's what we're here for. That's what sustainability, personally, to me is. It's about trying to do better. It's a tough industry. We use a lot of resources to produce our metal, but if we can improve that a little bit at a time, it goes for big gains.
Yeah. Keeping a bit on the sustainability angle, I know, Erin, you know, new technology is your line of business. Do you have any advice about companies mining tailings ponds or old tailings? I know that you've been doing some research in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this space, actually, and it doesn't just focus on the tailings ponds itself, but at least from my perspective, being a mineral processors, we like to think, you know, what can we do upstream? So, you know, there's technology might not be the only answer, but technology can really help. I mean, for example, a lot of people interested in pre-concentration strategies. So a lot of interest in ore sorting over the past number of years. So can we sort out waste upstream to make sure it's not ending up in the tailings ponds? Now, there's a lot of economic assessment we've worked through with Ben, you know, there's a time and a place, but that doesn't work all the time. But there's other technologies that you can explore. So again, microwave treatment. Can we fracture the ore along grain boundaries and not grind it as fine? So then our tailings are coarser, and maybe we could dry stack them or doing something different. On the other end of the spectrum, there's some companies doing some really interesting things with the tailings that they're generating rather than putting them in a tailings pond. So I was actually on the phone this morning, or like a FaceTime call with Alan Cram. So he used to be a VP of innovation at Anaconda in Newfoundland. Now he's with the spinoff company, he's VP at Nova Mera. So this is a spinoff company that Anaconda created for their technology that they were developing for sustainable mining by drilling, which is also very, very interesting. But they are selling their tailings as aggregate. He showed me, they have built a loadout and a port specifically for their tailings that they are selling to you know, areas in the United States. So they are looking at their entire ore body as having potential value, as opposed to saying we're just taking out the gold, we're selling the gold. They're selling the entire ore body. So I love this shift in thinking. It's not just technology, but it's also culture. Other interesting things they're doing, you know, think back to the golden age of metallurgy, where, you know, all these big mining companies had research centers and they were developing new uses for nickel, like new alloys, nickel foams, different things. Well, Anaconda is developing new uses for tailings. So they're developing a new soil amendment that they call rock dust. They're growing potatoes in it. You know, there's other things that they're looking at. So just this shift. So combination of culture and technology can really go a long way to solving some of these challenges. And to, you know, Ben and Carrie's point, how can we do it better, right? And that's really what it's about.
Well, we only have a few more minutes left, so why don't we kind of shift into that cultural piece that you were speaking about, Erin, and you know, what are companies doing for diversity and inclusion? Because I think we can all really agree that maybe the large mining companies aren't really moving the needle in terms of diversity and inclusion. So can we give the investors some advice on, you know, how do they truly look at the practices that companies are doing? You know, I don't think having sort of quotas of having so many women in your organization is really cutting it. So, you know, Carrie, do you have some advice on what people should be looking at?
Yeah, thanks, Tabitha. Yeah, the diversity, equity, and inclusion part has always been a challenge that's really plagued the mining industry. We're, you know, typically known as a, you know, male-dominated industry. I mean, we see three females on our panel here, so obviously that's changing. But is it changing at all levels in mining? And it's slow to come. I think what mining companies have realized is that, like you said, Tabitha, The quota system isn't the goal. The quota system is a measurement, and measurements are always good. But the real benefit of diversity, equity, and inclusion is making sure that we have different ways of thinking represented in our companies. And generally, by the reason why we look for people who have different genders, different ethnic backgrounds, it's because they have different life experiences, and that can really lend well to an innovative culture, a culture that's accommodating and thoughtful of, say, the local communities in which they work. That's generally why mining companies look for a strong local labor component, is because they're looking for people who are representative of the communities in which they work. And then also looking for people who represent the customers that they're going to be serving as well. And I mean, you know, the world is diverse. And so, you know, making sure that we have that diversity of thought represented. And generally, you know, we look at that in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion by seeing, you know, do we have different groups represented in all levels, especially, you know, right now we're looking at the boards. It's, you know, companies that are publicly traded are generally required to report how many women are on their boards. It's starting to get down into the management levels too. And you know, BHP, for example, made a bold statement a number of years ago saying they wanted a gender equal workforce, which is a, you know, pretty bold statement, you know, 50% female male representation. And I'm not sure where their numbers are at right now, but I think that's they have a long way to go.
Mhm.
But generally, I think what we're looking for here is, you know, how can we get different ideas represented? And then how do we actually successfully you know, meet those targets? You know, it's one thing to say, I want a 50% diverse workforce, but it's a whole other ballgame to actually get those people in the door. So it's examining, all companies really need to examine their practices and say, okay, what are we doing in terms of how we work that is encouraging more diversity in our hiring? And I'm going to also, I'll throw the word retention out there, because that's a difficult one too. And I know my other panelists can speak more intelligently on the retention aspect, but that's clearly a challenge for mining industries right now in terms of making sure they still have a diverse workforce.
Well, and I think too, if anything that we've learned over the last couple of years is we can work anywhere and still be successful and still create the products that our clients are looking for. So I think, you know, in that spirit, we should be really open to more diverse working situations, and that will lead to better retention. You know, if I have an employee that needs to move somewhere, they can work remotely and still be successful. So we need to change our attitudes.
I think Tabitha, I know you're going to wrap up. I was going to say,
ahead.
I think it's going to be necessary. I mean, I was talking to a senior person from a large OEM, and he was saying they're losing people right, left, and center because companies like Google, Tesla, et cetera, are hiring people and they can work anywhere in the world, right? And they're offering competitive salaries. So I think mining companies, in order to keep, you know, even their less diverse workforce, are going to really have to rethink how they are supporting their employees. And I think that's happening, right? But it's only going to have to accelerate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I promised that I'd give you each a couple of minutes to give some key takeaways to the listeners. So Ben, I'll let you start off.
Okay. I think for the investors gauging a mining company, start looking at what accreditation programs they're running and who else is running them. That's a good start, and it takes away some of the jargon and gives you some surety. The other big thing for me is let's come up with some metrics. Mining is different. Let's maybe look at ratios around production. There might be other figures in the financial statements that are unique to mining situations. Maybe tailings liability, closure liability. If we can find some numbers to really zero in on our situation, it really might help force change. Because if you're looking at a number like closure liability, it might justify spending more money up front to go to dry stack rather than doing our traditional wet tailings. So I think there's opportunities there, but the investors, the investment community, and the people who do analysis for investors probably really should start thinking about coming up with some smart numbers to look at, maybe doing it a bit different to what we've done in the past. They're my two bobs worth.
Perfect.
Thanks, Tabitha.
Okay. Carrie?
Yeah, I'll build on Ben's comment about the metrics. Yeah, I would encourage transparency as much as possible. I think the only way that ESG from a comparability perspective really works is if we encourage the companies that we're investing in to be transparent with their information. And I mean, not to the point where we, encourage we're giving away secrets or anything like that, but ultimately, just making sure that we're keeping our eyes on the goals. I also want to encourage investors to encourage innovation. We heard from Aaron and from Ben both that innovation does not have to be terribly expensive and really can set your company apart. And, given again that we're selling a commodity, things that you can do to set your company apart and be more sustainable and profitable in the long term is worth a small investment in the upfront. And finally, I just want to mention the importance of community as well. So, I mean, mining companies are no strangers to this. We need to have the communities on board before we put a drill in the ground in order to, make a mining project actually go ahead and work. But it's bigger than that. It's bigger than just getting approval from the local community. I mean, as mentioned, we're stripping these communities of the natural resources that are in their area, their long-term livelihood. So how are we making sure that the communities are benefiting truly from our economic activities? So, so keeping the communities in mind, is our mining project actually making our community better for the long term? That's the question you need to be asking these companies when they're talking about their community strategies. Are they making these areas better for the long term? Maybe the mine will be there for the long term, maybe it won't, but the community stays there. And so are we leaving it better off than when we came? And that's an important consideration that mining companies need to have. That I think a lot of companies are already investigating, but from an investor point of view, it's definitely worth asking and making sure that you're comfortable with the strategies and encouraging good community engagement.
Perfect. Okay, Aaron, your turn.
Yeah, I mean, I love quantitative data, to your point. I don't often find it, and I'm becoming increasingly comfortable with qualitative data. And, when I'm looking at, different companies, I'm truly impressed by the folks that are looking at mining and technology through a new lens, who aren't afraid to engage with folks outside of the industry at a variety of levels, colleges, trades colleges, universities, different startups and SMEs. Who can address these challenges that we're facing as an industry with fresh eyes. And to build on your point, Carrie, I'm personally very passionate about EDI within the industry as well. But I am cautious when I see EDI statements and sustainability reports, because I know from my personal experience and from my students and women and other folks that come to talk to me, that doesn't always translate to the ground. So when I'm evaluating the track record of a company on EDI, I speak to people, I look at who's working there, and it's not just women. So we made the point that there are 3 women on the panel, but we're 3 women from similar backgrounds, and none of us are working for large mining companies right now. We don't have any other underrepresented groups. There's no Indigenous, Black engineers, for example. People from the LGBTQ community are not heavily involved in mining, and so looking at the EDI strategy, is it appropriate? Is it innovative? I mean, innovation in EDI strategy is a thing as well, right? I had an email in my inbox about, indigenization 2.0. These things are constantly evolving as well, and our companies engaged with that and with the community and doing the right things. And is that translating to get people in the door and to keep them? Because that, we've talked about retention, that's really critical. I mean, back to women, a lot of women reach the 5-year mark in their career and think, I don't need to be a martyr anymore. So, companies really need to think about how they can change the culture so that people want to stay and innovate, because that diversity of thought is really necessary to innovate and create a sustainable industry.
Perfect. Well, thanks everyone. We're at our time limit, and I really appreciate your time and discussion. It was great, and hopefully the people at SME taking the course have learned a lot today.